Österreich ist nicht das Werk eines politischen Zufalls und nicht das Werk einer Theorie. Österreich ist aus Jahrhunderten der Geschichte gewachsen. In diesem Land haben sich Ordnung, Verantwortung und Ausgleich entwickelt, lange bevor moderne Parteien und Ideologien auftraten. Wir glauben nicht an den Staat als bloße Machtmaschine, sondern an den Staat als gesellschaftliche und sittliche Einheit. Österreich hat seine Aufgabe nicht darin, Moden nachzuahmen, sondern darin, seine gewachsene Form zu bewahren und zu erneuern. Perhaps one of the most unjustly overlooked stories of the 20th century is that of Austria. Most of the time it is reduced to the assassination of Franz Ferdinand and Hitler's Anschluss. It's perhaps obvious, maybe even appalling, to those aware of the Austrian history. The empire, or more directly, the lands stretching from Vorarlberg to Burgenland, formed the cultural and political center of southern German civilization for multiple centuries. Though fortune and misfortune came and, especially during the course of the 19th century, went, no one could have predicted the disastrous decline awaiting the nation in the early 20th century. From a mighty empire, the embodiment of the old world order, reduced to an obscure realm state stripped of dignity. It is no exaggeration to say that Austria lay in ruins. And yet there was hope. In the early 30s, Austria seemed to recover. Amid the political and economic instability, a new regime had suspended the unstable, artificially imposed democracy, the Fatherland Front, led by war veteran and Minister for Agriculture Engelbert Dollfuss. Under him, Austria experienced spiritual revitalization, an economic recovery, a preservation of Austria's integrity against Slavic irredentism. And yet, in 1938, Hitler annexed Austria in the Anschluss, drove to Vienna, hailed by the masses. How could this happen? How could this regime that nearly revived the southern German spirit be crushed so easily? During the 19th century, the Empire of Austria experienced for the first time sharp decline. The previous golden age under Maria Theresa and Joseph II was succeeded by the harsh, humiliating defeats of the Napoleonic Wars and collapse of the HIE. The Hungarian Revolution under Kossuth Lajos, the defeat in the Second Italian War of Independence, and loss of Lombardy already left Austria deeply scarred in 1866. The disastrous defeat in the Boer War symbolized the end of Austria's role as hegemon. Thanks to heavy concessions to the Hungarians, the empire ultimately avoided collapse. Yet the imperial spirit was scattered. The now recognized dual monarchy was burdened with competing nationalities and fading geopolitical significance. In the following decades, Vienna attempted one last time to restore lost prestige with the occupation of Bosnia-Herzegovina in 1878. A gamble that ultimately failed. The empire overstretched massively. The already diverse ethnic landscape increased even further. In that condition, the monarchy entered the 20th century. A state neither in decline nor revitalization, compensating internal division and external revanchism, when the fatal day in July of 1914 would ultimately signal the beginning of the end. As the war dragged on, the Austrian home front suffered increasingly from food and resource shortages. The indecisiveness of the Austrian parliament culminated in the Kriegswirtschaftliche Ermächtigungsgesetz, KWEG, the War Economy Enabling Law of 1917, expanding extra-democratic legislation to a wide range of administrative issues. This will prove decisively relevant later in the story. The Treaty of Saint-Germain signed in 1919 did not merely end the war, it ended the world. For Austria, it marked not the conclusion of a conflict, but the formal recognition of a collapse that had already taken place. What had been dismantled on the battlefield and dissolved in administration was now sealed in law: the disappearance of Austria as an imperial power and the reduction of its existence to a political remainder. Austria emerged from the First World War not defeated in the conventional sense, but ontologically diminished. The empire had not lost territory alone. It had lost the conceptual framework that justified its existence. Saint-Germain transformed Austria from a civilizational structure into a small republic, whose borders bore no relationship to its historical function. The most immediate consequence was territorial dismemberment. The Habsburg lands were partitioned into successor states: Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, Hungary, Poland, and others, each founded on the principle of national self-determination. Austria was reduced to a narrow Alpine realm state, stripped of its economic hinterlands, industrial regions, and agricultural bases. Vienna, once the capital of a vast empire, became an oversized metropolis, presiding over a state too small to sustain it. The territorial reduction produced severe economic consequences. The imperial economy had been an integrated organism. Raw materials, industry, labor, and markets had functioned across regions now separated by borders, tariffs, and currencies. Furthermore, scattered, persisting overnight. Austria inherited that administrative center, but lost the material body that had sustained it. Additionally, the treaty forbade any unification with Germany. Paired with the loss of South Tyrol and the Sudetenland, this alienated the increasingly powerful national German factions. Socially, the consequences were equally severe. Millions experienced downward mobility, loss of status, and cultural disorientation. Former imperial officials, officers, and civil servants found themselves redundant in a state that no longer needed their functions. The educated classes retained memory without power, the working classes bore economic hardship without hope. Changement equaled a civilizational collapse. The archaic lawlessness caused by Changement and Trianon left the fragile Austrian core threatened by all sides. From the south, the Italians had occupied South Tyrol, the Czechs and their irredentist further marched into the Sudetenland. The Yugoslavians preyed on the Slovenian parts of Canton, despite their loyalty to the Austrian nation. Internally, the threat of communism was quickly suppressed, yet externally remained with Belarusian Soviet in the east and Bavarian Soviet in the north. Amidst the collapsing order, the countryside also was repeatedly pillaged by the now disbanded KUK army units. This utter lawlessness created the ideal environment for local self-defense forces, the Heimwehren or Home Guards. Much like the German Freikorps and Einwohnerwehren and Hungarian Tiszti Kölöni Tmények, the Heimwehren started as relatively localist grassroots movements led by peasants and the petite bourgeoisie, aiming to protect their homeland. Soon they were joined by the demobilized officers, provincial intellectuals, and the now disenfranchised aristocracy. The previously mentioned Yugoslav claim in Canton resulted in a series of border skirmishes over the courses of the early 20s. However, they would significantly decline during the rather stable mid-20s. Given the new circumstances, the various militias justified their existence mostly as a counterforce to the socialist Republikanische Schutzbund or Republican Defense League. But it would be the July 15 riots in 1927 that would enable their second rise through a renewed public fear of the Red Threat. It's here where the Heimwehren truly united to the Heimwehr. Like many similar movements at the time, the Heimwehr was not at all unitary, but comprised of many different factions. This promotion in rank was largely through the support of both Mussolini and Ignaz Seipel internally, who favored the Heimwehren as a practical tool against Marxist agitation. By the end of the 20s, the Heimwehr could claim a following of 150,000. To unify the till this point extremely homogeneous movement, the various Heimwehren pledged allegiance to the program formulated in the Kronenberg Oath by Richard Steidle and Julius Raab. This oath goes as followed. We want to fundamentally renew Austria. We must forget our own advantage. We must absolutely subordinate all parties and demands to our own cause, because we want to serve the community of the German people. We reject Western democratic parliamentarism and the party state. We are fighting against the disintegration of our people through Marxist class struggle and liberal capitalist economic policies. We will overcome the class struggle, establish social dignity and justice. The power and leadership ensure that the estates remain subordinate to the needs of the national community. Let every comrade recognize three powers: faith in God, his own unwavering will, and the word of his leaders. The main points to be taken are a rejection of republicanism embodied by the present regime, a view of nationhood as an organic state comprising the populace in its entirety. To better understand the events of the now beginning Republican era, we first need to clarify the state of the emerging political factions. The young republic started its existence with a general social democratic domination by the Social Democratic Party of Austria, SD. Notoriously, Austria lacked a strong communist party, mostly due to the fact that the working class, especially in Vienna, backed the SD almost unanimously and that their leadership adhered to the tenet of Austro-Marxism. Throughout the 20s, the SD would repeatedly pull 46 to 41% of the vote, establishing them as a force to be reckoned with. On the other side of the parliamentary establishment spectrum stood the CS, the Christian Social Party, attracting anyone from the rural population over the self-employed middle class, industrialists, and surviving aristocracy to the devout parts of the working class. The party can broadly be summarized by two characteristics: Catholicism and nostalgia. The latter dominated the party in the eastern and Alpine provinces, while the western parts adhered more to the idea of agrarian Christian democracy. The third and electoral as well as organizational weakest camp comprised anything from bourgeois liberals to conservative nationalists, with bureaucrats, civil servants, employees, professionals, and well-sized farmers making up the broad electoral basis. Notably, this faction gathered almost the entirety of Austria's Protestants, who after centuries of counter-reformation and expulsions throughout the centuries, out of feared sympathy for Prussia, developed expectedly actual fondness for the Protestant North. It thus comes to no surprise that this stemmed the initial basis of the German nationalist Greater German People's Party, GVP, and the Peasant Union, LB. Furthermore, the Austrian Nazi Party fell into this camp as well. On a finishing note, I want to mention the lack of liberalism in the political landscape. The Liberal Party, which dominated in the Imperial era, lost its momentum in the early 1920s. Though the fragmented political structure of Austria made societal cohesion almost impossible, the various factions fascinatingly shared one core ideal: German nationalism. Ironically, the imperial collapse caused the nation to express the same ethnic mentality as Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia. The fast emerging, partially pragmatic, partially ideological desire for Anschluss was, however, devastatingly crushed by the Entente. Therefore, it is crucial to keep in mind the general adherence to pro-German sentiment even within the SD. Unsurprisingly, the Great Repression shook the Austrian nation to its core. The already weakened economy utterly spiraled downwards. With the collapse of the Kreditanstalt Bank in 1931 and the looming threat of the entire financial system collapse, the ruling CS government was forced to sign the Lausanne Protocol on July 15, 1932. The protocol granted international and indeed desperately needed loans. The cost was the government legitimacy. Among the main conditions for the protocols was the renewed prohibition of the Anschluss. The political outrage utterly destabilized the ruling coalition. The GDV abandoned the CS-led coalition protest, nearly causing the government collapse. On top of that, the Austrian Nazis increasingly consolidated their position in the third camp. In the 1942 regional elections in Vorarlberg, Lower Austria, Vienna and Salzburg, the NSDAP gained 16% of the votes each. While nowhere as prominent as their northern counterpart, it scattered the establishment of the conservative parties. Great parts of the following of the GVP and LB, as well as the Heimwehr, increasingly deserted to the NSDAP. As a consequence, the pressured CS was increasingly willing to cooperate. Even with this tremendous success, the NSDAP's radical wing grew impatient with the status quo, demanding an immediate unification with Germany. Despite the resistance of the moderate members, most notably Seyss-Inquart, the party initiated various terrorist incidents across the nation. At this point, it is necessary to deviate from the current events to introduce the arguably protagonist of this story. In May 1932, under the increasing internal pressure, a new government coalition formed under the helm of Minister of Agriculture, Engelbert Dollfuss. Born on October 4, 1882, as the illegitimate child of Josefa Dollfuss and the miller apprentice Joseph Enninger, Engelbert Dollfuss grew up in the lower middle-class agrarian family of a stepfather Leopold Schmutz in Kirnberg. Young Dollfuss
lived on his stepfather's farm surrounded by nature. As typical for Lower Austria, the farm was far apart. Not clustered into villages, but isolated, surrounded by its own fields, forests and meadows. Dolphus' childhood home could truly be called paradise. Human creation in harmony with beautiful nature. All life was certainly hard at times. The family possessed a certain affluence. They could afford to employ some farmhands and maids. It was the norm for young Dolphus that the family would eat at the same table as the workers from the same pot. Of course with a clear hierarchy present, yet more in paternalistic, not condescending nature. The concept of class struggle was absent, as the land required everyone's contribution. This would have a strong influence on Dolphus' beliefs later on, as he not only witnessed hierarchy in benevolent manners, but also participated in the work whenever possible. Outside of work and school, he was fairly active in the church, becoming an altar boy, though at first incapable of exercising this task, as no cassock fit the extremely short boy. However, the priest, fond of the bright, charming boy, arranged to alter the garment for him. Two important characteristics are to be taken from here: his height and his character. Dolphus was extremely short throughout his life, only 151 centimeters tall, and unsurprisingly made him targeted for bullying. But Dolphus usually managed to sway the people with his personal charm. By most accounts he was articulated, charismatic, and genuinely kind-hearted. When his youth drew to a close, Dolphus saw himself destined for the priesthood, and embarked to study theology at the University of Vienna in 1912. It was certainly an exquisite time to witness Vienna. The city had indulged into a cultural golden age, comparative to none in Central Europe at the time. Music, art, literature, every kind of culture blossomed in the Habsburg capital. It was a time of Mahler, Brahms and Freud. As Stefan Zweig reminisced in his memoir, The World of Yesterday, there was something indescribably attractive in the way Vienna lived for culture. Art was not something remote or solemn, it was part of everyday life. Music flowed through the city as naturally as Danube, and even the humblest of citizens felt himself entitled to an opinion on opera, theatre, or literature. After some months he abandoned his ambitions for the priesthood, and studied law from then on. With the fateful events of 1914 and Austria's declaration of war against Serbia, Dolphus, like the vast majority of the population, was overswept with enthusiasm. He promptly volunteered, but got rejected for being 2 centimeters below the minimum requirement stature. Driven by dedication and conviction, Dolphus did not let this determine his fate. He promptly traveled to St. Pölten in Tyrol, in hopes of being accepted this time. But as fate wanted it, the same doctor that rejected him in Vienna was present that day in St. Pölten. However, moved by his incredible determination, he let it pass this time. From then on, he served as a Kaiserschütze in the 2nd Imperial Royal Tyrolean Rifle Regiment at the Italian front south of Tyrol. He served for 37 months consecutively, getting promoted to first lieutenant in the process. His comrades remembered him as brave, loyal and determined, regardless of circumstances, receiving many medals throughout, such as the Karl Tropp Cross or the Military Merit Cross 3rd class. When the war ended ultimately, Dolphus returned to the university as he had not yet completed his studies. In these early post-war years, Dolphus found employment in the Lower Austrian Peasants' Union, arguably his first real exposure to politics, as his duty essentially was to outcompete the rising Marxist counterparts. He proved highly effective and his rank grew. For his merit, he was eventually sent to continue his studies in Berlin. Unsurprisingly, he was completely appalled by it, as it was literally Weimar Berlin, which he witnessed. Besides absolute social decay, unemployment, pornography everywhere, child brothels, transgender surgeries, drugs of all kinds, organized crime, communist militias, and corruption within the city, he especially disliked the communist and liberal intelligentsia at university. After ultimately graduating in 1923, Dolphus came to work in the Lower Austrian Chamber of Agriculture. All of this paired with his extensive social network would at last get him appointed Federal Minister of Agriculture in 1941, and with the nation deteriorating, Federal Chancellor in May 1942. Following Dolphus' rise to power, the CS quickly formed a coalition with the LB and Heimwehr, with significant influence for the latter. The reaction was a strong denouncement by both SD and NSDAP, and they called for early elections. However, Dollfuss, aware that this already narrowly preserved coalition would not survive early elections, could not accept this demand. Thus on March 4, 1933, he declared a state of emergency. In the Nationalrat, the parliament, stating that the parliament had eliminated itself. Among the participating factions, it turned out to be received fairly popular, both internally and externally. Meinoud Rast von Tönningen, financial observer of the Lausanne loan himself, would support Dollfuss' usage of the KWG, allowing the financial aid to continue. In general, Dollfuss could count on the backing of Mussolini and at least acceptance of Miklos Horthy, regent of Hungary. Yet internally, the Dollfuss government didn't have concrete plans for nation building, but rather understood when to take advantage. And that way proved to be very successful. The SD was completely paralyzed in the process. Foolish legalist appeals did little to sway anyone. A general strike was almost impossible due to the mass unemployment. Their presence in the regional governments eroded and their private militia, the Schutzbund, was banned by May 1933. The second main rival, the NSDAP, would not be spared either. On May 16th, the party, SS, SA, and Styrian Heimatschutz were banned. The reason for this was a series of terroristic attacks against the regime, caused by an increased fanatic spirit following Hitler's appointment as Chancellor on January 30th. Though Dollfuss would keep in contact with members of the NSDAP's moderate wing, most notably says Inquart. This new society was to be corporatist, Catholic, and German. The coalition's factions then were unified in May 33 to the Vaterländische Front, the Fatherland Front. Both the army and the church backed the regime extensively. However, Dollfuss was by no means able to monopolize his power. The Heimwehr, both vital ally and chief rival, under figures like Emil Fay, had to be appeased repeatedly and was granted multiple powerful ministries. Most importantly, the position of Vice-Chancellor, which would be granted to Fay and later to the perhaps most essential personality of the Heimwehr, Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, the descendant of Ernst Rüdiger von Starhemberg, who liberated Vienna from the Turks in 1683. On the occasion of that 250th anniversary, Dollfuss held the Trabrennplatzrede. His speech called for a new crusade, this time directed against liberalism, communism, and Nazism. Importantly, it would also serve to promote the demands Mussolini had tried to support during a meeting in Riccione in August 18, 1933. Thus Dollfuss declared, "The time of liberal capitalist social and economic order is over. The time of Marxist popular leadership and popular seduction is over. The time of party rule is over." The consolidation for the new regime did not work smoothly, however. The SD, now in large parts an outlawed organization, increasingly feared a violent takeover by the rightists. Negotiations, initiated in October 33, failed to deliver, despite extensive debate between Dollfuss and Karl Renner, the SD's leading representative. On February 12, 1934, the police in Linz was tasked with searching the local SD headquarters for guns and ammunition. The latter promptly opened fire. Fighting quickly spread beyond the city to the urban centers, mainly Vienna, Graz, and Steyr. The Heimwehr police, at first unable to crush the uprising, slowly gained ground as the federal army, the Bundesheer, sided with the government. Till February 15th, the Schutzbund was defeated. In its aftermath, all remaining opposition was either banned or incorporated. The SD, already de facto illegal, was banned on February 12th. The incident claimed 300 lives, as well as several hundred combatants and bystanders wounded. The conspirators of the uprising were tried and all sentenced to death. However, 15 of the 24 death sentences given were annulled. The majority of the communists and socialists still in the country were interned at Wöllersdorf, just as many national socialists. The party leadership of Otto Bauer and Julius Deutsch led to Czechoslovakia on February 13th. The isolation as well as the internal friction caused Dollfuss to align himself closer with Italy. Thus on March 17th, Dollfuss, Mussolini, and Hungary's Prime Minister Gyula Gömbös signed the Rome Protocols, formalizing close cooperation against German revisionism and Yugoslavia. With a now more or less stabilized situation abroad, the focus shifted again to the home front. On May 1st, a new constitution was ratified. The so-called May Constitution of 1934 officially marked the end of Austrian parliamentarism and the Republic. In its wake, a new, furthermost Christian, corporate, and German state would emerge. The Ständestaat was officially born. On July 25, 1934, Dollfuss worked in his office at the Federal Chancellery. At around 12:30, a dozen armed men, disguised as Bundesheer soldiers and police, stormed the building. Gunfire ensued between the intruders and Federal Guard. What was happening was a coup the Austrian Nazis had planned since June. Dollfuss, caught in the crossfire, got shot twice, injuring him severely. Immediately he collapsed to the floor. Repeatedly he asked to send for a doctor and a priest. And again, the insurgents declined. Thus, Engelbert Dollfuss, Chancellor of Austria, spent his final hours surrounded by his enemies. Reportedly, even while dying, he treated his captors kindly, praying for Austria, forgiveness for his murderers, and all his compatriots who had followed him to this very point. In the early afternoon, the bleeding got worse. Dollfuss repeatedly fainted and grew increasingly weak. Around 4 o'clock, he closed his eyes one last time. Engelbert Dollfuss was dead. Even with Dollfuss gone, the putsch was ultimately unsuccessful. Having failed to capture any of the ministers of Federal President Wilhelm Miklas, the insurgents failed to gain momentum. With the Bundesheer remaining loyal to the regime, the uprising seemed more and more doomed. On the 30th of July, it was over. The Nazi command under Anton Rintelin ultimately capitulated. Against the odds, the Ständestaat had endured. Still, with Dollfuss dead, the leadership was essentially vacant. Question remained: which faction would succeed him? The position was eventually passed to Kurt Schuschnigg, Minister for Justice and Education, on July 29th. Austria was in a dire state at this point. Nearly bankrupted, increasingly dependent on Italy, internally unstable, with the threat of German expansion growing daily, the Schuschnigg era began. However, Schuschnigg would prove to be a competent leader. He sidelined the Heimwehr, enforced the May Constitution, and suppressed the Nazis for the time being. An officer himself, Schuschnigg inferred power increasingly to the army, away from the Heimwehr, de facto obliterating any fascist influence, at least on an ideological basis. Yet still, with peace somewhat restored, the uncertainty of the future remained. Italy, increasingly reliant on Hitler due to being diplomatically isolated thanks to the Abyssinian War, idly stood by. On July 11, 1946, Schuschnigg and Hitler signed the July Agreement. Mussolini, in need of Hitler's support internationally, had urged Schuschnigg relentlessly to ease tensions with Hitler at a meeting at Rocca delle Caminate prior in June. Having de facto renounced all claims to the Danube basin, the Italians essentially sacrificed Austria in a grand game of geopolitics. Though the exact content of the agreement might appear as a triumph for Austria, with Hitler even adding to have no interest in annexing or conquering Austria, it was obvious that Vienna was internationally de facto isolated now and forced to negotiate with the country which launched a coup against it only 2 years prior. Still, Schuschnigg could hold on. Having somewhat overcome the threat of annexation for the moment, the situation seemed to stabilize. Yet behind the facade, the regime was crumbling. Public support had shrunk. To a third, international support dwindled, and the demand for pan-German unification was present everywhere. Even Schuschnigg himself had sympathies to these ideals, regardless of how vague and broadly speaking they were. On January the 25th, the Viennese police raided the headquarters of the NSDAP, uncovering plans for a putsch. The thus resulting violence and increasing German interference into internal affairs caused Schuschnigg to visit Hitler at Berchtesgaden on February the 12th. When he arrived, he mostly found himself berated and urged by Hitler to fulfill a long list of demands. Most notably, the appointment of Nazi officials to the government, most notably Seyss-Inquart as Minister of Public Security, which meant handing over the police to the hands of the NSDAP. Due to the increasingly stark and blunt dictation, Schuschnigg began to lift the ban on the socialists in return for political backing, specifically the promise to back Austria's independence in the case of a referendum, which would be held on March the 9th. On March the 11th, Hitler sent Vienna an ultimatum: hand over power to the NSDAP or face invasion. With the plebiscite turning out overwhelmingly in favor, and neither Britain nor France willing to protest, Schuschnigg resigned on midnight. Seyss-Inquart, now Chancellor, ordered the Bundesheer to not intervene in case of a German invasion. In the following hours, the Wehrmacht entered Austria. On March the 13th, Austrian sovereignty was over. The regime that lasted from 1934 up until this 13th of March 1938 is among historians generally classified as Austrofascism or clerical fascism. However, this view is far too simplified. First of all, at no point did Dollfuss, Schuschnigg, or any other noteworthy PF leader declare the movement to be fascist. Granted, a rather simple point, but worth mentioning since the fascist movements of interwar Europe generally proclaimed their ideology proudly, a pattern that can be observed from the Mosleites in England over the Eurocross movement in Hungary to the corporatism in Latvia. And while there was a notable fascist faction in the Heimwehr, this one was sidelined until 1946. Any notion or element with fascist character, such as private militia, youth movement, and public symbolry, is thus rather to be seen as a concession to Rome. The term itself, Austrofascism, was indeed used during the Dollfuss-Schuschnigg era, yet only from the socialist opposition, increasingly in post-war Austria in order to silence any remaining third-position sympathies as well. The name the regime carried throughout its existence was Ständestaat, or corporate state, and the ideology was proclaimed as ständisch, corporate, though this translation doesn't really do justice to the meaning. Ständisch can best be explained as hierarchical in an almost feudal sense. And indeed did Dollfuss admit that he himself viewed medieval society as ideal. The Ständisch project, as he envisioned, aimed to free the Austrians from the poison of the Enlightenment, to abolish class warfare, and to let the people strive to contribute for the greater good. This view wasn't even new for the time. Already in the 19th century, did the Austrian political class, most notoriously Karl Lueger, develop the concept of Austria as an anti-liberal entity based on Catholic social teaching. Indeed, it would be the Catholic corporatism as envisioned by Pope Leo XIII in the Rerum Novarum in 1893, which would serve as the foundation of the Ständestaat. Additionally, Ottmar Spann's universalism and Ignaz Seipel's political Catholicism contributed heavily to the worldview of the Heimwehr, and later the VF. Surprisingly, Dollfuss seemed to be, at least initially, not particularly interested in the developments of Salazar's Estado Novo in Portugal, and only under Schuschnigg did relations ultimately tighten. The Kingdom of Hungary, under Horthy, served unsurprisingly as an inspiration as well as a mirror, whether or not the country only 14 years prior. Hungary was regarded in general as a second central bastion of Catholicism in Central Europe. Ironically, Horthy himself was a Calvinist and Prime Minister Gömbösch Lutheran. Regardless of its minor role internationally and short existence, the regime would inspire other third-positionists and their views, above all in the Baltics. Carlos Ulmanis of Latvia and Konstantin Päts of Estonia did model the governments of the corporate chambers of Austria and coincidentally came to power in a similar fashion as Dollfuss. Posthumously, it would also inspire Béla Imredi's Hungarian Front and Josef Tiso's Slovakia. To answer the question why this ambitious and effective project was so short-lived, we have to look at general conditions at the time. Crucially, the idea of not only a corporate state, but fundamentally an Austrian state was not prioritized by a large segment of its people. These people had legitimized their separate status from Germany through their imperial identity, an identity which was now gone. Moreover, the belief of pan-German unity was common within the entire political spectre. The only noteworthy faction to oppose this were the Habsburg loyalists. But with the sudden death of Kaiser Karl and the Allies' ferocious resistance to a Habsburg restoration in both Austria and Hungary, which tied Dollfuss' hands, the VF couldn't realistically count on them either. Secondly, the VF struggled to keep its internal factions, most of all the Heimwehr, at bay. This led to its program to be extremely vague in order to not alienate one of them, or perhaps more importantly, Mussolini. Furthermore, the fact that the entire regime persisted rather through fortunate circumstances rather than strategy, it didn't improve the situation. Also, it is important to remember a chronic instability caused by the insurrections of the Nazis and socialists alike, which ultimately claimed Dollfuss' life as well. Paired with the crippling impact of the Great Depression, a true nation building was impossible and direly needed achievements never came. At last, even with the concessions given to the various factions, Vienna still managed to alienate many, especially Austria's Protestants, already one of the most pan-Germanic groups in the country, were now faced with Catholic systematic oppression, unknown since the 19th century. Dollfuss' disinterest in any easing of tensions led especially to the Lutherans to view Hitler as the lone possible savior of Austrian Protestantism. In short, the Ständestaat as a state simply began too late, with too much external and internal pressure. Perhaps, if already implemented in the 20s, it could have turned out differently. I want to share my own thoughts finally. The respect I have for Adolphus, Schuschnigg, and Stauenberg is immense. I truly admire their vision and furthermore would have longed to see how a second, a third positionist German state would have performed. But I also want to clarify that I myself am pan-German in sentiment. The Anschluss itself, I cannot condemn. It was only the logical conclusion, no different to the countless others prior, like Castile and Aragon or Moldova and Wallachia. The people, already ambivalent to the status quo at best, clearly favored unification. At the time it was not the Anschluss, but a Blumenkrieg, or flower war, because of the countless flowers thrown as the people of the Danube joined their brethren into one nation. After the war, we were split up again legalistically forbidden to unify. Austria had to serve as a buffer zone from then on. Its culture slowly dissected through the excess of liberalism and cultural Marxism, which imposed an artificial Austrian culture separate from their northern brethren. And they do not further the Nazis either, for it to be absolutely clear, but the fact remains that never before nor after were the German people won, except for this short era started on March 13, 1938.